stole my thunder about the sabotage. Can you see? Okay. So, what I want to focus on today is the economics of the NDP. I'm not going to attempt to take you through the NDP, but rather focus just specifically on the economic chapter. As Gavin has indicated, we're talking about, is the NDP a radical shift along the lines of what the ANC spoke about at its National Policy Conference in Mangaung? Was it a radical regression back not only to 1996, but even perhaps pre-1994? So the politics of the NDP are firstly, just very briefly, the ANC in Mangaung endorsed what they called the vision of the NDP, and the idea was that they would engage the detail later. There was no interrogation of the actual content of the document at Mangaung. I was present there in the Economic Transformation Commission. And the question of why the ANC adopted the NDP at Mangaung is a big question which I'll return to later if there's time. The packaging was that the NDP is a dynamic and living document. And what that really is code for is the idea that we'll endorse the sort of broad vision of the NDP, but we'll engage with the detail later. And a lot of people at Mangaung were saying, look, there are lots of problems, and in fact some of the commissions identified specific problems. But broad vision we can live with, and we'll engage with the detail as we move on. This underestimated, one, the contradiction between ANC policy and the NDP, and two, the pressure that existed within the state and within the right in society and in the movement to align all other policies with the NDP, as I'll indicate. And the key areas of contestation have been the labour market and economic policies, which is what we'll focus on. So in terms of government, the President in his State of the Nation address in February this year really spoke about the NDP's long-term vision. He emphasized the infrastructure development program and IPAP, and really devoted very little attention to the proposals of the NDP. But by the time he responded to the opposition in his State of the Nation address, he announced that the July 2011 Cabinet Lekgotla would realign all government policies to the NDP as the basis for government's next year 5-year plan, which is called the Medium-Term Strategic Framework, which will cover 2014 to 2019. So from a broad dynamic vision, we now have the NDP as the flagship program of government to which all government programs and policies would be aligned. And that is what government's in the process of doing. The business and the DA in particular strongly pushed for the realignment of 2 programs of government, that is IPAP and the new growth path to the NDP. In June, COSATU took a resolution which basically analysed the NDP, identified the fact that the labour market and economic policies of the NDP were particularly problematic, rejected them, and called for the realignment and redrafting of the economic chapter of the NDP. Following the COSATU critique, the South African Communist Party issued a document in which they supported COSATU's critique of the economic chapter. We then went to the Alliance Summit in August, September this year, in which there was an agreement that these concerns of COSATU and the SACP are legitimate and that they must be addressed, and that the economic chapter needs to be, the word that was used, was adapted to address all the specific issues which COSATU had identified. And what I'll do is briefly show you the resolution of the Alliance Summit, which hasn't been made public at this point, but I thought it would be important that you could see the content of that particular resolution. Since the Alliance Summit, leaders in the ANC and government have given very mixed signals about this decision. Some, for example, the deputy chair of the NDP and the deputy president of the ANC has openly endorsed and ratified the decision of the Alliance Summit to say that the Alliance task team, which is meeting at the moment, will look at these problems and address them. Other leaders within the ANC and government have taken a different line to say that they're going ahead to implement the NDP. In the article which has been distributed to yourselves, we analyzed the problems with analyzing the NDP, that it's extremely difficult to decode, analyze, and understand the NDP. Just understanding the economic chapter was a major enterprise. For the reasons we outline here, that it's complex, lengthy, it speaks in code, masking its underlying theoretical approach, uses certain buzzwords to appeal to constituencies in the hope that they won't recognize some of the unpalatable proposals. It's inconsistent and contradictory. MPC experts come from conflicting perspectives and approaches, and Presidency and the Treasury have placed their perspectives into the document. In particular, the economic chapter, we're aware that Treasury in essence drafted that particular chapter. The NDP selectively uses certain government policies and ignores others. It contradicts critical elements of the New Growth Path and IPAP, which are government's lead economic strategies over the medium term. Also, by the way, the NDP had claimed to be a long-term strategy to 2030, but if you look at it, it deals with a number of short-term and medium-term proposals, which is now reflected in the medium-term strategic framework. The plan is riddled with errors, and in the just a bit distracting. The plan is riddled with errors, and in the paper which we distributed to you, we've identified some of the errors where it confuses its own projections on poverty, unemployment, and makes elementary mistakes. We've listed the errors here. I'm not going to go through them. I can go through them later if people want. In the document which we distributed, we put up this chart, which really is the pivot vision of the NDP. It identifies the key economic targets. Now, what we say is that on the face of it, those targets look very good, and it seems logical that everybody would support those targets. They're ambitious, they're positive, but when you look at the detail, then the problems in the NDP economic vision become clear. The headlines are: the NDP proposes to create 11 million jobs by 2030, reduce unemployment to 6%, reduce inequality, and eradicate what they call extreme poverty. We'll come back to that. But when you scrutinize the economic proposals of the NDP, the core proposals, you find that the proposals in the NDP, if implemented, will undermine and frustrate the realization of those very objectives. So the NDP won't achieve its targets. And we then identify 6 major areas. The first is the employment strategy of the NDP is problematic and unsustainable. Secondly, it fails to pursue the vision of industrializing the South African economy. Thirdly, in terms of its labor market proposals, it's premised on undermining worker rights and a low-wage strategy, which is fundamental to its vision. Fourth, it proposes a business-as-usual macroeconomic policy. Fifth, it accepts the persistence of high levels of inequality. And sixth, its poverty and unemployment projections are dubious. So what I'll do is go into each of those areas. Firstly, on its jobs plan, it's premised on the creation of low-quality, precarious jobs outside the core productive sectors of the economy. The 11 million jobs, where do they come from? The NDP says that 90% of those 11 million jobs will come from small and medium enterprises. In other words, 9.9 million of the 11 million jobs will come from SMMEs. How will those be created? We'll come back to that in terms of its labour market policies. But in terms of the existing structure of the South African economy, we argue this is a completely unrealistic and unsustainable plan. SMMEs, according to research that was released recently by UCT, have shown little increase in share of employment over the last decade. And this recent study of firm performance concludes that job destruction was actually far higher in small firms than large firms, which have a higher rate of net job creation. So the NDP expectation that 9.9 million jobs will come from SMMEs is highly unrealistic. we argue that it's likely that many of these jobs won't materialize, and those that do will be mostly of low quality. The NDP concedes that in the first 10 years, it is premised on the creation of largely low-paying jobs as opposed to decent work. So the SMME-dominated low-wage strategy is very different from the policies adopted by the ANC and the Alliance on decent work, on an economic policy mandate which foresees a growth path which is based on redistribution, on raising the effective demand in the economy, on restructuring industry, and seeing manufacturing as the engine of economic development. So, of course, this is very much in line, and if you go back 10, 15 years, you'll see in Treasury's old documents that this is very much in line with Treasury's old vision, which they've been driving for some time. And at the core of that is deregulating labour markets. Because how are the SMMEs going to produce so many jobs? One of the proposals of the NDP is that SMMEs are exempted from certain labour legislation. Secondly, the NDP fails to pursue a vision of industrialisation, in particularly in the IPAP. I've challenged the NPC Secretariat to show me one place in the NDP where they actually mention the Industrial Policy Action Plan, not mentioned in the 480-page document once. The vision of the IPAP and the NGP is the role of a radically expanded manufacturing sector as the engine of the economy. Not because of the numbers that will be employed in the manufacturing sector. A lot of people confuse this. It's not that there are going to be vast numbers employed in the manufacturing sector, but because of the multipliers of the manufacturing sector as the heart of economic development to alter the trajectory of economic development, to address many of our structural macroeconomic issues, and to build a more equitable economy. So the new growth path aimed to move from a narrow consumption-led, financialized and service-driven economy to an industrialization strategy. The NDP fails to take this vision forward, and it revolves, as we said, around an SME service-led perspective. The plan envisages the share of manufacturing in total jobs will actually shrink from around 12% in 2010 to 9.6% in 2030. Of course, 11 million jobs will have been created, so the absolute numbers in manufacturing will increase, but the share will decrease dramatically to 9.6%. But employment in services would increase by 5 million jobs, or up from 30% as a percentage of employment to a whopping 40% in 2030. So of the 11 million new jobs envisaged in the NDP, nearly 2/3 will come from services, domestic work and the informal sector. That is obviously not an industrialization or diversification strategy. The second slide on industrialization just goes through the fact that the economic vision of the NDP is one that, well, internationally now we've got to accept that economic development is services-led. This is the way we've got to go. We've got to move towards a knowledge economy. In other words, Tina, there is no alternative. But it doesn't reflect on the fact that our growth path has already mutated into this consumer-driven, service-centered economy with absolutely disastrous economic and social consequences. So to reinforce it in our long-term 20-year plan is the height of folly. The second implication drawn by the NTP is that we now have to come to terms with this international reality that atypical work will dominate, and therefore we must adapt to the reality of insecure work, contracting out, labour broken, and so on. It also, it goes even further to postpone, to suggest postponing certain interventions which our infrastructure program, IPAP, and our industrialization strategy are currently doing, like, for example, through the procurement strategy, leveraging the infrastructure program to go into a massive build of local production, to say that this should really be done in 2018 to 2023. And I won't go into more detail about that, I'll come back to it. The NDP does not have an industrial strategy, it rather talks about a cluster strategy. And it has this very brief, pathetic, to be honest, identification of certain clusters, which is half-hearted, fails to propose serious measures to transform the structures of the economy, and is premised on the virtue of competitiveness. It's interesting that while the NDP talks about the need for structural transformation, it doesn't anywhere in the document propose an anti-monopoly strategy or real competitiveness strategy to deal with the current monopoly structure of our economy. The only area where it deals with competitiveness is in the section on state-owned enterprises, where it's calling for greater competition to be introduced with the private sector in state-owned enterprises, but not in the private sector. There's not a problem in the private sector. It's export-driven. It goes back to the gear strategy of opening our economy to the cold winds of competition. I won't go into that in any more detail. So if we go to the issue of worker rights and the labour market strategy, the key to the employment strategy, as I indicated, is that Treasury vision of deregulating labour markets. The plan proposes a series of measures. This is not something that we're imagining. If you look through and decode the chapter, take away some of the very positive sounding proposals in the chapter, at the core of it are proposals which would have the effect of undermining existing worker rights and promoting a new stratum of ultra-low paid first-time workers. This is the key to the NDP's economic proposals. Because what they say, Treasury in its diagnostic report to the NDP says that the entry-level wages of workers are too high in South Africa as a proportion of average wages. And they compare it to other countries internationally. The reason for that simply is low-paid, blue-collar workers come into the labour market earning poverty wages. After 10 years, they're still earning poverty wages.